Well, this is take two. Earlier today I tried to do this from outside and the birds were wonderful on the video, but unfortunately the wind was a little too strong and you couldn't really hear what I was saying. So I'm doing this again from my desk at my home. Hey, have you ever wondered or ever had a conversation with someone or a group of friends, and then a few minutes later, or even a few years later, others take the details of that conversation but take it completely out of context and then make it sound like something you never said or intended? Or maybe they take something you said completely out of the conversation and just to make it mean something different than what you meant it to be in the context of that conversation. We see media do this all the time to politicians and other people. But how would it make you feel, or how does it make you feel when someone does that to you? Now imagine someone else who speaks a different language takes that conversation, interprets it in their language, and they change a couple of words that's more conducive to their language, but unfortunately it sort of changes the meaning of the context or the situation. Well, I imagine this is a little bit like what Jesus must feel when it comes to the conversation we started looking at yesterday in the book of Luke in chapter 21. So many people have deconstructed this conversation and removed parts of it out of its context and made it into something else instead of just letting Jesus guide the conversation. Now usually when I do a two-part message or a three-part message, I take some time on part two to explain some of the highlights of part one, but that's because there's usually a week in between them. Now, because these things are on video and we just downloaded part one yesterday, I'm going to ask you, before you go any further in this video, to take about 15 minutes or so and check out yesterday's video in order to have a better context for what we're talking about today. Take a moment to learn the difference between two extremely important Greek words in the text we've been talking about. The word souteleia, which means the end of the world, the end of all things, and telos, which means the end of a certain event or a chain of events. Learn the importance of a Greek word called peride, which is basically a way of saying that the author or speaker is changing directions in the conversation. It's interpreted in Matthew 24 as but concerning in verse 36. Learn why it's important not to read these chapters, meaning Luke 21 and its parallel in Matthew 24, why it's important not to read these chapters without setting aside preconceived ideas about things like a so-called rapture and other events like the second coming, and making these words mean something that they don't. Learn why it's critical to ignore those dividing headlines in some of your Bible translations and just allow Jesus to lead the conversation. Now, even though we are working our way through the book of Luke and we're into chapter 21, we are primarily using the parallel text of the conversation in Matthew 24 to guide us because it's got better clarity. Yesterday we left off Matthew 24 around verse 6, a very important verse in which Jesus makes an important distinction between the end of the world as we know it and the event which started the whole conversation altogether, which was not one stone being left upon another, or the destruction of the temple and the temple courts. Now he does this by using a different word than the disciples used when they asked the question. The disciples used the word souteleia, which means the end of all things, because they assumed that the end of the temple had to mean the end of the world. But Jesus, in answering it, he changes it to telos, which means the end of a certain process or events. So as we made clear yesterday, everything from verses 4 through 35 in the Matthew 24 text is talking about a specific time period or a chain of events leading up to a conclusion. In Luke 21, I believe it's verses 8 through 33. And namely, leading up to the end of the telos event, which is the event of one stone not being left upon another, or the end of the temple. Now, in talking directly to disciples, he said, you will hear about wars and rumors of wars. And then he goes on into verse 7, which reads, when nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these things are but the beginning of the birth pains. We don't have time really to get into the details, but if you take the time to read some Roman history, you'll discover that there were many wars that took place in the first century, especially in the Roman Empire. In fact, Rome captured Great Britain in 43 AD. There were wars between the Roman Empire and the neighboring Parthian Empire, and even many civil wars within Rome itself. In fact, in 68 to 69 AD, there were 4 different Caesars. Now you can read about some devastating earthquakes and famines that took place. One famine, and is even mentioned in the book of Acts, the same author as Luke, in chapter 11 of that book. He goes on to say, Jesus does, "Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake." Now again, who is the you in this conversation? The disciples. In fact, it sounds an awful lot like a lot of the events in the book of Acts from when the disciples were speaking in front of kings and rulers, which is actually mentioned in the Luke text. And then he goes on here in the Matthew text, and he says, "And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another, and many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold, but the one who endures to the end will be saved." Luke adds another part of the conversation in his version, saying, "So make up your minds not to prepare beforehand to defend yourself," talking about speaking in front of rulers and kings, "for I will give you utterance and wisdom, which none of your opponents will be able to resist or refute." Now again, who is the you and what is the context? Well, the you that Jesus is speaking to is the disciples. And the context is before political rulers and kings prior to the end of the telos event. The you is very important because it's amazing to me how many preachers will take this particular statement out of its context and use it as an excuse not to prepare adequately for a Sunday message, and then claim to trust the Holy Spirit when in reality they're testing the Holy Spirit. The disciples didn't have what we have today. They didn't have the New Testament because they hadn't written it yet. Anyway, you go on in verse 16. It says, "But you will be betrayed even by parents and brothers and relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death." Again, who is the you? The disciples. Did some of them die before the end of this telos event, this destruction of Jerusalem? Absolutely. Now we go back to Matthew 24 and we come to another often misunderstood and misapplied text in verse 14. "And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come." Oh boy, how this text gets abused and misused is mind-boggling. There are some who teach that we need to make sure to get the gospel preached to every nation and language in the whole world so Jesus will come back. If by doing this, that we can manipulate or jumpstart the process of Jesus' return. While it is important to take the gospel to the whole world, that's not what this verse is teaching. First, this is another text in which it's important to understand language and the culture and the use of language of the first century Roman Empire. The term whole world here comes from a Greek word which refers to not the whole world as we think of it, the entire globe, but rather was a word people used to refer to the Roman Empire. It's actually borrowed from the Greek, or stolen from the Greeks, because they used the same word when they were the main empire, because to them the whole world, the civilized world, was just them. Nobody else mattered. The Roman Empire felt the same way about their empire, so they used that terminology. The same word is also used when Luke writes in chapter 2 of his Bible, of his gospel, about Augustus taking a census taken of all the world. Now, he's not referring again to the other empires in place. Definitely not the Parthian Empire. They would have had something to say about that. He's actually referring to the Roman world. It's the same word he used when telling how Satan tempted Jesus in Luke 4 and showed him the kingdoms of the world. It's also the same word he uses when talking about the famine in the whole world under the reign of Claudius in Acts 11. Again, he's talking about the Roman Empire. And by the way, it's also the same word used in Revelation 16 when talking about the kings of the whole world in reference to Armageddon. Now, the world in all of these verses, again, is not talking about the globe and the world as you and I know it. It's not talking about places like Antarctica, Canada, South America, or even the United States, and all of the other places on the opposite side of the globe. It's referring to the Roman world. But there's another critical thing about this verse 14 in Matthew 24, where it says, "Then the end will come." Guess what word is used there? It's not Sunteleia, It's not the end of all things. It's the word telos. In other words, Jesus is still talking about the one event in which one stone will not be left upon another, the end of the temple and temple courts. So, question is, does the gospel get preached to all of the Roman world prior to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD? Well, according to Paul in Colossians chapter 1, it's particularly in verse 23, it does. You see how important context is? You see why it's so critical to let Jesus guide the conversation here and not let our preconceived ideas or the dividing headers in some of our Bibles guide us in how we read the verses. Now we get into some really confusing parts of the conversation, as if you weren't confused already. Things that are wildly taken out of context. And what happens when you take things out of context? You can make it mean whatever you want them to mean, right? Well, so let's pick it up in Matthew 24, verse 15. As Jesus begins to tell them exactly what to look for, what to do and not do, and when to get out of town. He said this, "So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place," and then in parentheses he says, "let the reader understand," as he doesn't want his readers to miss this. Now listen, don't miss this verse, because again, who is the you? The disciples, right? This is Jesus himself saying that what he's about to talk about is something that some of them will witness personally. It will be the fulfillment of the abomination of desolation prophecy of Daniel that we hear so much about in today's culture. It's not some event in our future. It was an event that would take place in their future at this time, but not in our future. He goes on to say, "Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house." In other words, don't go back and get your furniture. "And let the one who is in the field not turn back to get his cloak or his coat. And alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days." Hey ladies, you ever try to go somewhere fast when you're 9 months pregnant or even have a baby? You can't run very fast, right? He goes on to say, "Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath." Why? Because no one could go in or out of the city on the Sabbath. "For then," he said, "there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world." And by the way, this is the same word he used earlier, meaning the Roman world. "Until now, no, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being will be saved." In other words, he's not talking about salvation of the souls here. He's talking about saved physically. "But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, 'Look, here's the Christ,' or 'Hey, there he is,' don't believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders." And by the way, that doesn't necessarily mean miraculous. It could just be great feats. So they would perform these things and lead people astray, if possible, even the elect. "See, I have told you beforehand," Jesus says. "So if they say to you, 'Look, he,'" meaning the Messiah, "is in the wilderness,' do not go out. If they say, 'Look, he is in the inner rooms,' do not believe it." So let's stop here and talk about this text for a second. First, let me answer this question. If Jesus was talking about the Synteleia, the end of all things, the end of the world as we know it, and he was talking about his second coming, then why would he tell them to flee? What difference would that make? None, right? I mean, where are you going to go when the end of the world is happening and Jesus is returning? So obviously he's not referring to the end of the world as we know it. He's not referring here to his second coming. And the abomination of desolation that Daniel is referring to, Jesus says, whatever happened, that's going to be the fulfillment of. It's during this telos event, not something 2,000 years from then. So what is the abomination of desolation he's referring to? Well, Luke actually tells us by how he phrases Jesus' words in Luke chapter 21, verse 20, where he says, "When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that their desolation, or her desolation, is near. Then those in Judea must flee." And then it goes on to say, "because those are the days of vengeance." You see, these armies, known as Roman legions, were led by men who were carrying spears with a graven image of an eagle at the top of it, one of their many idols. An abomination in Jewish eyes was any graven image in the temple area. Now, to put the meat on the bones of our text, to kind of give us some real world structure. In the days leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, the event that unfolded was absolutely incredible, and the grotesqueness of some of these things that took place, as written by first century historian Josephus, was so bad they probably couldn't even be shown in a rated R movie today. So let me give you just a quick summary of some of the things that took place, and I'm going to warn you up front that this is not for the weak stomach. By the mid-60s AD, the Jews were fed up with the bigotry and the abuses of the Roman Empire, and they were looking for anyone to step up and lead some kind of revolt or charge against Rome. Well, as a result, there were three major fanatical guerrilla groups, all known as zealots, within Israel. There was more, but there were three that really stood out. And each of them were fighting for control, making themselves out to be messiahs. All three of them were also starting little battles and wars with Rome. In their civil wars, though, within the city of Jerusalem, they killed so many of their own Jewish people that Josephus said that bodies, instead of being buried, were being piled up, and it was said to be sliding down the bloody steps of the temple area. People literally had to step on or step over them. In a fight for control, one of the groups burnt down storehouses of food that would have been enough to last for a 3 or 4 year siege, and it ended up causing a famine like any they had ever had before this point. In fact, it was so bad that some adults were even killing, cutting up, cooking, and eating their own small children. Now, to add to this famine, when Passover came, the Romans opened up the gate to let all the Passover pilgrims from other cities come in. And then they shut the city gates behind them, not letting anyone leave. Tribulation? Yeah, they had unimaginable tribulation. And I'm not even beginning to scratch the surface here with this description. Now, this begs the question, did the followers of Jesus heed his warnings and get out of Dodge before it was too late? Well, if the sign to leave is when they see an army surrounding them, how in the world do they even leave? Well, check this out, and this is absolutely fascinating. Without going into all the details, in 66 AD, a Roman governor of Syria by the name of Cestius Gallus marched into Jerusalem to put down a revolt. After multiple diplomatic attempts failed, he surrounded the walls with the army, which would have been carrying spears with a graven image eagle, this abomination. And then when he couldn't break down the wall, he decided to try to burn down the south gate to gain entry. But before he did, and for reasons that absolutely nobody could explain, he stops and he takes his army and he leaves. The Jewish military rebels interpreted it as a sign of God, and they followed them, and they killed almost 6,000 of them in between two mountains. Well, this big victory is what gave many Jews the idea that they could defeat the Roman army for good, so they started signing up for service. But little did they realize at the time that all they did was stir up the hornet's nest. A year later, a different general by the name of Vespasian, who would actually go on to become a Caesar, he took over and he began an assault on from Syria on Jerusalem that would eventually chase every Jew within range into Jerusalem until the final assault finished the job. So the question is, did the Christians get out? And the answer is yes. The rebels were right about it being a sign from God, but the sign was not for them. It was for the Christians, or the believers, to get out of Dodge. Josephus wrote that when Cestius Gallus left, distinguished Jews left the city like sailors deserting a sinking ship. Now, he doesn't specifically name the Christians, but other writers from that era said that Christians did leave and went to a town east of Jordan called Pella. Now, here's what's really interesting about this. When Cestius Gallus left, it was mid-October to early November, 4 to 6 weeks before winter. You see, the Christians knew what to look for because of Jesus' word, and they got out when he told them to. Isn't that absolutely incredible? Now, we're not done. Tomorrow, we're going to deal with a part of the text that sounds even more like Second Coming talk, in which Jesus used some creative language. But guess what? We still haven't even got to the end of the telos event. We haven't even got to the periday in verse 36. So this is going to be interesting. So until tomorrow, my friends, stay faithful, stay safe, and let's stay connected. Love you. See you tomorrow.